Cool.
Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined by a special guest, Dean Brooke. He was recommended to me by the usual contributor, Keith Preston. He said he thought Dean had some interesting insights into geopolitics, and since the last few roundtables have been about geopolitical predictions and flashpoints, I thought it would be interesting to get Dean's perspective. Now, Dean comes at this from a more economic and demographic analysis. And he also writes for the Rogue Economics, right? That's your blog, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
And that's included in the show notes.
rogueeconomics.com. That's something else.
All right. So let's start with sort of framing this discussion quickly. So we're both generally familiar with the works of George Friedman and Peter Zeihan, and they seem to dominate the discussion of geopolitics. And for lack of any alternative, I think it's good to work within the rubric they give us. What we both agree on at the outset is that there are lots of challenges that nations across the globe are going to deal with. All the nations are going to have to deal with it. Some have a better hand than others. And then the other problem is nobody has an ideal hand. So whether it's the United States or China or Europe or Russia, there's pros and cons to each side. And I think what we're going to see is going to be different nuances between our positions, that we're going to weigh certain things differently. And that's going to explain a lot of the differences. But where we agree is those 2 points. So let's start with the North America. So if you look at both Peter Zeihan and George Friedman, especially in George Friedman's The Next 100 Years, they're very bullish on the United States and Mexico. Now, for the United States, what Friedman says is, well, we've got, again, the powerful economy, the strong dollar, the global reserve currency, classic stuff like that. And the United States is allied to all of these nations around the world that are fearful of Russia and China. And so those rising powers, say in Southeast Asia or Europe, are still going to look to America as an ally. Peter Zeihan would say, well, not only that, the United States has a lot of good farmland out west. It has rivers to facilitate trade with domestically. And so they, looking at all of that, would argue that, and also they would both agree that we have a highly educated elite for making national decisions and a highly educated working class for technical development. Now, with Mexico, what they both say is they tend to look at short Mexican economic growth over, say, the last 20 years, which has been fairly bullish. And so they'll say that, well, if we continue this trend out, we can project at some point, I think at the end of next 100 years, Friedman predicts a showdown with Mexico and the United States. By that point, he predicts that the Mexican economy will be such that it is a competitor to the United States. So given that that's sort of what we're going up against, what do you think about their overall predictions about the United States and Mexico?
Well, I think with Mexico, you've got to remember it is still very, very early on in the game. And I mean, without looking too much into the history of long-term predictions, and their track record of accuracy, I think that really what you've got to think about in terms of Mexico is that as a consumer nation, are they going to eventually make that move to, for instance, what the US has done and go for that, develop militarily and more geopolitically? And that really, I mean, at the moment, they've got a very strong consumer sector, but to sort of come up against the USA, you're going to need more than that.
I think with Mexico, too, the other problem is this extended period of stability that occurred after 1930 with the PRI, I think is the party, which the one party state that Mexico has been, because prior to 1930, Mexico was riven by revolution and internal discord. And we're beginning to see with the rise of the cartels in the 80s and 90s that the sovereignty of the state is called into question. And can Mexico navigate this problem? I don't really see Friedman or Zeihan giving a lot of attention to that. And that's really the decisive element. Can they get on top of this cartel problem and the threat to state sovereignty? At the moment, I don't really see them capable of doing that.
Well, I see Mexico as being very geopolitically exposed as well, because, I mean, their biggest trade partners are the US and China. So you can see why I say that they've got a lot of exposure to the kind of turmoil that's going on at the moment. you know, and whether they can sort of be on both sides, I think, is a big question.
So now the United States. What do you think about the predictions there?
Predictions? Can you be a bit more specific?
Right. So Zeihan and Friedman would argue that the strengths that the United States has, which will keep it in more or less the same position it is now for the next, say, 100 years, is from Friedman, the strong economy, the tech industry, the fact that they have a large pool of elite leadership. Zeihan floats the idea of like 2 million people, rivers to facilitate trade, as well as the agricultural base out west for food production.
I mean, I think one of the biggest issues going forward is people tend to confuse the economy with what's going on in Wall Street. And that's not really the same thing. So, for instance, if you look at the performance of the S&P, you might be tempted to say, well, that represents the performance of, the economy as a whole. And that's not really the same thing in practice. There's certainly a lot of left behind areas in the USA, for instance. And I think that overall, if, I'm bullish on the USA long term, but to me, that's different to looking at the stock market. The S&P is very exposed to this trade war that's going on between the US and China.
So if we, look at the linchpin of US global power, which is the dollar, and more specifically the petrodollar, this is where you have a little bit of a different take than a lot of people. I think you're more in substantial agreement with Zeihan here. But what's your take on?
Actually, I don't think I am, because, see, one of the things I don't like about Zeihan is that he still believes in the myth of money printing. And, this is a typical libertarian trope that, people believe that the Fed can just print money ad infinitum, and, that it's financing the deficit through this sort of match of money printing and fiscal borrowing. But that's not really the case in practice. And Zeihan hasn't realized that yet.
Right. Now, if we look at these strengths of the United States, I think one of the things, if you read Zeihan or listen to Zeihan, and as well as George Friedman, they seem to think that the United States of today bears a lot more of resemblance to the United States of, say, the New Deal era, where a lot of these trends that they're observing now are in some sense radiating out from that time period. But what I don't think they are paying proper attention to is the fact that there's large parts of the United States in which that assumption is increasingly breaking down. So these are some of the challenges that I see. One is, as wealth has been fleeing the heartland to the cities, and then from that to these global institutions, to what extent can the United States manage that? Because if you have this increasing gap of the haves and have-nots, as we saw, for example, in Tsarist Russia, for example, it does breed a kind of revolutionary resentment, if not dealt with. Part of what the New Deal did was say, well, we have all this money from the cities and the federal government, and we're going to plow that back into these rural areas to lift them up. Now, I don't really see that happening at the moment. That's not to say that it couldn't happen.
Yeah.
The other thing that I see as a challenge is Michio Kaku, 15, 20 years ago, said the only reason why the United States is a tech leader is because of the H-1B visas. We can basically get the best engineers and scientists from all over the world into the United States. But there's, I think, two problems here. One is that's because there's a lack of domestic production, for one, and that hasn't been addressed yet. And then two, once these developing nations reach a sufficient level of parity with the U.S., that the expected cost of leaving to go to the U.S. is less profitable than just staying behind and building up, say, India.
Well,
will we lose that edge?
I actually think there's two problems with that, because you've got to remember a lot of the nations that the US is sucking up talent from are also the most demographically moribund. It's fine to look and say that you can steal all the world's best students, but that presumes that the world's got a constant supply of students. And especially with nations like Japan, probably the worst trouble demographically. I think the reliance on imported talent is not going to hold into the next 100 years or so.
Exactly. Now, also with the vaunted political class that Zeihan likes to point to, one of the things is if we look at the last 20 years, and I would argue the boondoggle of the wars in the Middle East, the mishandling of COVID, depending on which perspective you want to take by both Trump and Biden, the question is, this is, I think, the hinge question for America navigating these challenges. Given that we have the resources available now, in some objective sense, if we had, say, talent of like the New Deal era, would we be able to weather the storm in a stronger position than we ended up? Probably. But the question is, do we have that same kind of leadership available today, 100 years on? And I think in light of the last 20 years, that's an open question.
Well, I think the bigger problem is also the degradation of universities as well that's taken place. I mean, if you look at the kind of tuition that universities are offering and the price that it comes at, I think that's a much more fundamental challenge, because it's fine to say, unless you can educate people up, then you're not going to get that pool of talent for cutting edge industries.
Yeah, exactly. So I think now, obviously, we could partly contextualize this as part of the business platform of Stratfor and Zeihan. You tell the investors what they want to hear, but I do think that the American.
I think that's partially where you get this myth of money printing that keeps recycling itself.
Right. I think the American position is much more challenging for the leadership to navigate than a lot of these geopolitical analysts would have you believe. Again, that's not to say that it can't be navigated, but I think they're sort of emphasizing the competency of the leadership class to a degree that I would not be comfortable doing.
Yes and no, to be honest. I mean, I think that the education isn't the real issue. The problem I see a lot of the time is simple information gaps. How educated your political class are doesn't matter if they don't have all the info.
Well, that's a good point, right? So we had, in the Bush administration, we had the claim that we create our own reality. When you have attitudes like that, it creates the bubble effect or groupthink, where you're totally disassociated from what's going on. And even within your own country.
I mean, a classic example is what's going on in Russia at the moment. You've seen that Putin has been so heavily briefed by people who are just telling him what he wants to hear, that he thought Ukraine would be it'll be a pushover. No one will do anything. It'll be over in 2 weeks. So I think that if you've got the most talented people around you, that doesn't matter if they can't say difficult and awkward things.
Exactly. Now, if we look at the before we move over to China, I think your point earlier that you made about demographics, like you said, the people were poaching from like Japan and South Korea. They have some of the worst demographic trends. Well, and frankly, even China. We'll get to China in a minute. They have terrible demographic trends. So if we say that, well, Zeihan would say the U.S. demographics is good, but that's because of immigration. But the thing is, though, it's only good because we're pulling immigrants from countries with declining populations. So once we kind of plateau there, how well will the United States actually be able to do that?
Well, I see that as actually a bit of a sort of feedback loop, to be honest, because as long as you've got capitals focused in these big nations like the US, to a lesser extent the UK, Germany, they're going to keep this feedback loop where if there's a big volatility event, capital from the risk economies just runs back to these for safety.
Exactly.
Driving migration away from the poor places back. So what you're really seeing over the long term is just the hyper concentration of capital, both human and financial. And I don't really see any reason to see that that's going to reverse, basically, unless, we have something unprecedented like a nuclear war.
I think now with East Asia, I guess there's two countries to talk about here: Japan and and China. So both Zeihan and Friedman are very bearish on China, both predicting that China is going to crack up sometime around 2030, 2040. And in his next 100 years, Friedman is very bullish on Japan, predicting a sort of Pearl Harbor in space, with the Japanese building their own with battle stars he uses. So, but here's what I see here, though. If we look at demographics with Japan and China, Japan's demographics, I think, can be argued are worse.
Yeah,
their demographics are terrible. And so in the long run, even though Japan has a highly educated, highly motivated, talented workforce, it's not being, recycled. There's not the next generation to fill those shoes. Will they be able to maintain the level of quality and standard that we have been accustomed to with Japan? And furthermore, to what extent, if America gets the sniffles, does Japan get the cold? We've just talked about how America has all these challenges. Depending on how the U.S. navigates that, it's going to have a huge impact on Japan, because Japan, since the end of World War II, has been very dependent on the U.S.
Well, I think that a lot of nations are dependent on the US because, as the top consumption power, the top exporting powers need it. And that's, it's as simple as that, basically. You have to, if you take the US out of the world economy, then you get a massive drop in the amount of goods that are being consumed. And where does that leave the top exporters? Especially with Japan, I think they're relying on automation and robotics moving forward. But given the state that education around the world is in, is that going to be a viable strategy if you're pinning your hopes on, such a cutting edge industry in that respect that relies on basically degree level workforces?
Well, and not only that, we have the last decade in Japan, the sort of a stagnant economy for the last 30 years. To what extent, because there used to be people saying in the 60s and 70s and 80s that predicted the Japanese economy would do what people are predicting the Chinese economy will do, supplant the U.S. But very rapidly, those predictions just kind of fell flat and people forgot they were ever made.
Well, to me, I think that's basically, I think a lot of those predictions are specifically put out by Wall Street as marketing PR for one particular product or another. And this is one of the reasons why you have to be very careful about making, or rather listening to long-range predictions that come out of Wall Street.
Right. Yes. Now, China. This is the real elephant in the room here. Now, what's the really interesting question here is we hear a lot of people say that China and the United States are each other's biggest trading partners. So we're not. There are those people that then predict where we shouldn't see a conflict of any, whether it's a hot war or more of a cold war between Russia and China, or U.S. and China, rather. But I would argue that that's not a guarantee. So prior to World War I, Germany and the UK were each other's largest trading partners. But there were other national considerations that led to the struggle. Now, this same economic theory would say, well, look, China needs U.S. markets to soak up their production. And then there's two schools here. There's the school that says, without the United States to soak up Chinese products, the Chinese economy would falter. And there's another school that says that's more bullish on China, says, well, domestic consumption and then consumption by Europe and Russia could compensate for any decline in U.S. consumption. So what are your thoughts on that tension, that debate?
I mean, an economy does not necessarily have to trade with the rest of the world as long as you've got sufficient wealth internally to soak up all that production. But I don't really see China moving up that sort of chain quickly enough to do that. I mean, they haven't got that kind of value-added manufacturing base or production base that can in turn generate wealth for its own people to soak up the low-end production.
I mean, that really is the question. The other question is, given the education of Chinese, can they educate enough of their population to be equivalent to their nearest competitors in managing these sort of high-level economic activities? Now, certainly,
there's education. I mean, will it be of sufficient? You can give two people a degree from two different countries, but are those degrees equivalent? And then you've got things like trade barriers. So 50 years from now, for instance, will the US have regulatory standards that will allow low-value Chinese goods in?
Exactly. Given the pivot that Trump seemed to take with the higher tariffs against China, if that trend continues, then that will limit Chinese sales of cheap exports to the United States. And the real question is, can they then soak that up either through domestic consumption or some other way? Because here's the problem, right? If the wealth is still kept at the top by the party and by those closely affiliated to the party, you then have the problem of, like the old factory. If you can't pay the workers enough to buy what you're actually making, how are you then going to sell what you're making? Well,
you have to lend them the difference.
Yeah, exactly. So are they going to, quote unquote, trickle down the funding to the average Chinese citizen? That's an open question.
I mean, to me, that again, the only way they can do that is to lend them the difference. And China already has a bigger debt bubble than anything that happened under subprime or the Bush government or the Reagan government. So I think that for China to expand domestic credit to try and soak up their own internal production is going to be a big ask.
Yeah, and we also have like the ghost cities and the apparent overproduction of railroads. So then the question is, how much state-sponsored production, which could be argued as wastage, can be maintained? Because let's look at the Soviet Union. A lot of the Stalinist industrial production, from a purely economic point of view, could be argued to have been, inefficient and profit loss. But nonetheless, the Soviet Union was able to keep up that game for quite a while. Eventually, it ran out in 1991. It collapsed.
Yeah.
So the question is, even if we concede all these points, how long can China keep this game going? That's another, I think, open question.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, we're working along very short time frames here. I mean, the PRC has only been open since the 70s, really. That's not a great long time when you consider the history of production in the UK or the USA.
I think the only thing that I would say here is that again, like a lot of these authoritarian states, China keeps a lot of the documentation behind the wall, or the Chinese firewall, or whatever. I am seeing trends that would appear to be similar to, say, Meiji Restoration Japan. So if you look at Japan in like 1866, it's essentially a feudal medieval society.
Yeah.
And then within 30 years, it's fighting China with a modern army. And within 40 years, it's fighting Russia with the modern army. Now, if we were to look at the past trends of Japan, we wouldn't predict a victory in the Russo-Japanese War. So the question is, has China made a serious enough commitment that it's in any way analogous to something like the Japanese modernization effort?
Well, not really, because I mean, I think Japan only sort of was able to put itself back together and modernize with the help of the US again.
Well, yeah, that was after World War II. But I mean, before World War II. So
yeah, so I think that as far as China goes, they've crammed such a significant amount of development into just 50 years that the only way they've been able to do that is by leveraging up the economy. Japan didn't really do that.
Right.
So I see them as fundamentally more vulnerable than Japan are, even with, Japan's arguably worse demographics.
Well, and let's also not forget food security too, because as the population is continuing to rise, their needs for domestic food production and then therefore food exports, imports rather, are going to go up exponentially. And in the light of the current Russia-Ukraine war and spiraling food costs, to what extent can China feed its teeming hordes? That's going to be a huge question for them to tackle.
Well, I think that's a global problem, to be honest. And to me, this is just going to give central banks the room to raise interest rates, because a lot of the inflation we're seeing now is a result of trade disruption rather than surplus liquidity. And so one of the things that I think we're going to see going forward is that the only way that Western central banks are going to be able to get inflation under control is to move back to a less accommodative regime and to raise interest rates and taper a lot of the stimulus spending. And that's not really good for any of the developing markets, full stop, really.
Okay, so now we're going to move over to Europe. And in Europe, there's broadly 3 countries that are focused on: the UK, Germany, and France. Now, in his next 100 years, Friedman is generally pretty bearish on all 3 of them. I think he's a little more favorable to the UK, but overall, he sees Western Europe as becoming less relevant. Now, if we look at Zeihan, he's very bullish on the UK. He's kind of met on France and a little bearish on Germany. Now, the reasons for Germany in particular, that's what I want to focus on, because they both write a little bit more about Germany than the other 2 Western European nations we mentioned. Germany's demographics, like the rest of Europe's, are awful. That is true. But I would argue that Germany's closest, most likely threat is Russia, whose demographics are much worse. So in this scenario that we're envisioning of all these challenges for these nation states, it's not so much that Germany has to be compared to the objective best nation, but it has to be compared to the nations which it's likely going to have to compete with. So I think if we sort of limit the scope of the analysis, and we'll get to Russia a bit later, I don't think Germany's position is quite as dark as Friedman or Zeihan would indicate. Now, Friedman seems to think that because the United States needs a base of operations in Western Europe against the declining hostile Russia, they're going to choose Poland. Now, his claim is, well, look, the United States can just create allies and then build them up. Now, in light of South Vietnam and the Vietnam War, in light of Afghanistan and the Afghan War, I think he overestimates America's capability of just raising an ally out of the ether. I think if they want to have a bulwark to Russia, I think the United States is far more likely to rely on Germany for at least a couple of reasons. One, Germany's industrial capacity for high-end, sophisticated electronics, optics, and firing platforms like tanks and fighters are the peer of Europe, peer of the world. Actually, I mean, even today, the M1A1 Abrams uses the 120 millimeter Rheinmetall cannon. So I think it's far more likely for both economic and geopolitical reasons that nation would be Germany and not Poland. And Germany has a lot of rivers, so feeding into the Zeihan thesis, that's going to facilitate a lot of trade in a way that you won't see as much with Poland, because the rivers in Germany don't go just north-south, they go east-west as well. So we see that now. Yeah, so why don't we just throw that to you, the broader thoughts on Europe?
I think an even more important factor is the capital flows. I mean, if you look at a nation, if you take Greece as the prime example of a nation in the EU that's had a real big economic crisis, you've just got a center of gravity, Germany, and of course all the Greeks who didn't want to go through that crisis have just run off to West Europe rather than see it out. And I think I see that in a lot of the East European nations as well, especially with the current prospect of war with Russia. A lot of the the blue collar groups from these East European nations are moving westwards. And again, you've got this center of gravity theory in play. Where are they going to go? You've got basically UK, France, Germany. Spain's not really a competitor yet. So there's only so many places where you can put capital in Europe at the moment that's not exposed to the ongoing saga in Ukraine and Russia.
Now, given that since Brexit, the UK has left the European Union, and they were the linchpin of the Eurosceptic movement, which included also Poland and Hungary, given the fact that things are heating up in Eastern Europe, and there's Scholz's new 100 billion euro German defense bill, I think it's reasonable to expect in the near future, sometime between now and 2040, a sort of federalized Europe with a sort of Germany as the senior partner and France as the junior partner based on their respective economic and population levels.
I think you're going to see a two-speed Europe.
Right. Yes.
So the only way they can really sort the EU out. I mean, everyone's forgotten about the financial crisis because there's been, more pressing issues. But the only way they can sort the problems out in Europe long term is to move to this sort of two-speed Europe where you have perhaps a less restrictive capital regime for the peripheral states that are still, undergoing a long-term financial crisis, and then a slightly tighter regime for the powerhouse states like France, Germany, to a lesser extent Spain.
Now, the United Kingdom is kind of the odd man out now, since it's left the European Union. On the one hand, it has strengthened domestic markets. Now, of course, Scotland isn't happy about that, and I think Ireland's still a part of the EU. So what do you see the course for the UK being in this new environment? Closer ties to the United States and Canada?
Well, I actively argue for the UK to look towards NAFTA. Long term, basically, because the problem is what's going on in the EU, they don't have consumption power or really any or other sort of power that would soak up British exports. You've got perhaps Germany and France, and that's it.
Right. Now, the other thing is we have with France. Now, currently, France, well, okay, before the Schultz bill, France was the largest spending European nation on defense outside of Russia. And they had, I think, the second largest army in Europe. And they're sort of building off the experience of West Africa and the Sahel fighting the other terrorist groups there, like the extended ISIS groups and whatnot.
Yeah.
Now, this is, I think, going to be a problem for all of the NATO nations. We've spent the last 20 years focusing on counterinsurgency warfare. Now, to what extent is that going to translate into a deficit against a more conventional threat, like what Russia's posing in the Ukraine? And if we look at France, at least on the energy level, because it's got all these nuclear reactors, which haven't, to my knowledge, been dismantled yet, it should be more energy secure than most other European nations, which, as they become energy scarce, France could be a net energy importer, which could be a great boon to France. But then the question is, we've seen a lot of domestic unrest with the yellow vests and COVID-19. So to what extent is France able to navigate these internal domestic struggles as well? While it looks good, from a sort of strategic picture, is that built? Is it a tree with a rotten core, or is its core good? That seems to be the question.
Well, I think the main problem France has got is this terrible political setup, which is, just a step away from chaos at any one time. You've got and you don't have any sort of real fixing points. We've had Sarkozy, and then the left got in, and then we've got Macron, and now it's looking increasingly like Le Pen might be a real contender. So every few years, you've got basically serious political churn. And I don't really think that's an attractive proposition to someone looking to asset allocate.
Yeah. Now Russia. I think at this point, almost everybody except certain elements of the far right are bearish on Russia. Now, what Zeihan and Friedman both really focus in on is the demographic crisis, and that really seems to be one of the biggest elements of Russia's weakness. And then the other thing is their economy is not a diversified economy; it's primarily energy exports, and so that leaves them vulnerable to fluctuations in energy prices. So then the question is, Russia also doesn't have a broad base of highly talented, educated managers that can manage advanced industrial technological production. And while it's true that the USSR sort of brute forced a lot of people like that, during the collapse of the Soviet Union and the nadir of the Russian Federation, they went to the West. Those people went to the West to get paid because life was not great in Russia. So all that Soviet investment in these technical experts kind of just was lost. And now Russia seems to have a third world economy, one of the worst demographics of all the nations around, and it's encircled by hostile Western powers. It just doesn't look very good for Russia.
Well, I don't necessarily agree that people are exercising amazing amounts of negative sentiment against Russia. I mean, at least in the UK, it's very common to hear people put about ideas that Russia is a powerhouse, they survive anything. And, my attitude to that whole, Russia survive anything, until they don't, basically. So I don't necessarily agree that there's a huge amount of negative sentiment on Russia, at least in the UK. Certainly this populist movement that we've seen occur since 2015, a lot of that sees Russia as some kind of conservative strongman in respect to Putin. And I think that that's been cultivated specifically by Russia in this giant game of smoke and mirrors to sort of curry favor in various other countries.
Right. So, but what do you think about Russia's chances in general, given these real serious, severe issues they have to deal with?
Well, I'd see Putin as being fundamentally incompetent, because he has allowed himself to be sucked into these things, and then he gets captured by another geopolitical move. So, for instance, if you look at what happened in 2014, when the Fed started raising interest rates and unleashed the dollar bull run that's still ongoing, that really hit Russia hard, because you had an oil collapse, and a broadband commodity collapse, while they were trying to fund this operation in the Crimea. So I don't think Putin is half as clever as people make out he is. And if you think about it, Putin is pretty much the last man standing, because who can you see really taking over when Putin resigns, is forced out, dies, whatever you want, pick your end. I don't think there's a real clear successor.
Yeah, that seems to be one of the really big problems, is who is capable of replacing Putin. Now,
No.
this is more of a meta issue that sort of ties all the things we've been discussing together, though.
Yeah.
Now, to the extent that for lack of a better word, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, are beginning to build their own competing parallel economic system to challenge the petrodollar. And to the extent that there are rumors that oil-producing nations in the Middle East are considering accepting the yuan as a means of purchasing oil. So the first question is, to what extent is the U.S. dollar dependent on being the petrodollar to be this dominant force in the world? And then the second question is, to what extent does the BRICS insurgency have to succeed? So again, I'm not proposing that the BRICS replace the dollar as the new global currency. It's more that they apply enough pressure at strategic points that there's a decline in dollar circulation for oil purchases, such that it creates this fundamental instability within the dollar economy. So what are your thoughts on that?
I don't see the petrodollar as being the primary issue. I think the debt dollar is a more important one. And what the US has done successfully since perhaps the end of the Second World War, the US has essentially captured nations by lending to them in dollars. So, for instance, you've seen recently Russia has come out and said that it will only service its dollars in rubles. And that's because they realize that they're in such dire straits with being able to get dollars to service their debt that they effectively have no other choice, because they're being locked out of the market to acquire dollars. And China's in a very, very similar place. I mean, there's something like 281 trillion worth of dollar debt in the world. And you don't have anywhere near that amount of dollars. So
yeah, that's going to create a problem.
And that's something that no nation can really solve, because if the US says, fine, we'll accept payments in rubles, well, that's such a massive devaluation of the debt that the US holds that I just can't see that happening. Because, I mean, what's the exchange rate of the ruble to the dollar now? So, 1 ruble equals $0.012. So if they accept 1 ruble per $1 worth of debt, that's going to translate to such massive losses by the people who hold that debt that I just don't see it as happening, because that's basically a default.
Right. So I think now what would be interesting to talk about is, so for Friedman, he predicted maybe the next 10 years, which he wrote that book about, I think, 10 to 15 years ago. So we're living through some of his first era predictions. Then I think he goes to 2050 and then 2100. So, so for 2050, what I would, again, looking at the trends that we see, and this is the key assumption here, right? If current trends hold, now this is important for at least two reasons. Which trends, right? Because depending on your specialization, you might focus on different trends. And then the question is, well, okay, but I'll give you a perfect example. So in like the early 1900s, people thought that the Russian economy was going to reach parity with the United States if current trends held. But then, of course, you had World War I and the revolution, and then Russia just spiraled off into oblivion. And so there were these other factors that the people who made those predictions were not either giving full attention to or aware of. So with that as a caveat, what I'm going to say is, I think by 2050, what we should expect to see is something akin to a Europe that is more federalized, with a sort of Franco-German core, what I might call, for lack of a better word, a neo-Holy Roman Empire, not so much in the sense of the ideology or culture that backs it up, but as the political structures. Because one of the reasons why there was a Holy Roman Empire was there's certain... Here's Europe's problem, right? Europe's problem is these competing nation states, if they keep on fighting each other, it leads to these bloodbaths, these world wars that just tear Europe apart. And so part of the reason why these nation states have a hard time breaking beyond their boundaries is because of the rivers and the mountains. It's a very crisscrossed continent. And so if you can centralize enough power somewhere to impose order over the whole continent or the majority of the continent, which then facilitates trade and peaceful interactions, there's a certain built-in need for that. The Roman Empire did that. That's why the Holy Roman Empire got started. And I think this is a third iteration of that underlying impulse.
I think that the problem with that is that you don't have the nations which make up the EU aren't on equal footing. I mean, we try and pretend they are because they share a currency, they share, a common set of legal norms and things like that. But if you look at Greece's economy is nothing like Germany's. So I think it's just unrealistic for them to accept the same set of rules, regulations, capital rules, all that kind of thing. So I think that the peripheral states are always going to be a barrier to federalization, because the more you try to federalize it, the more locked into operating at a yardstick that is far above what they're capable of is going to apply to nations like Portugal and Greece.
Right. So Russia by 2050, it'll probably still be around. I don't think. I think Friedman's a little overly generous in saying that it will have dissolved by then. But I think what we might see is a very anemic Russia, where we're going to see probably more ethnic tensions amongst the Muslim population. So what's going on is Russia's population declines dramatically. It creates this feedback loop where they're going to be very aggressive, because there's key strategic choke points across Eurasia that if Russia can control, they can garrison and defend with a minimum level of deployed soldiers, which is going to create this strange motivation where, as their population declines and it's less able to fight wars, precisely for that reason, they're going to be more aggressive. So I think what we could see is Russia bogged down in a lot of conflicts over the next 20, 30 years that lead to a slow bleeding out of Russia, which is going to compound the already catastrophic demographic failures. So Russia is going to be in this very anemic state by 2050. What are your thoughts on that?
A lot of these projections in their population don't take into account how many people are going to leave Russia, purely because of these sort of issues. Not all Russians are a fan of the war, even if they are generally pro-Putin, for instance. And I've certainly noticed that a lot of Russians are basically packing up their businesses and leaving because they know that the sanctions are going to make any sort of enterprise in Russia near enough impossible. So I think that the more Russia tries to provoke its neighbors, educated, productive Russians are going to feel a greater impetus to run off to Germany, the UK, and other EU nations like Poland.
Right. So China 2050, I think. Yeah. Well, we'll see with China. Now, again, I'm not necessarily making any predictions about the Chinese Communist Party, which may or may not still be in power in 2050. But I do think that by 2050, either through economic or military means, China will have sort of come back to its traditional role of Asian hegemon, in the sense that see, what I find interesting is a lot of people who talk about the rise of China within the last 30 years act like it's completely without precedent. Now, if we look at the history of Asia going back to the first emperor around 200 BC, we see that what Xi is doing is very consistent with trends in earlier periods of Chinese history, where they consolidate this central power and then exert economic and military control over the surrounding regions. So I think China of 2050 is going to look a lot more like, say, a traditional Chinese hegemon, like, say, the Ming Dynasty from, like, say, 1500.
Well, I think that, again, the problem is, are they going to have the sheer manpower to operate that kind of role? I mean, you can only be a regional hegemon if you can project power outwards substantially. And the question is, are they going to, A, be able to finance that, and B, be able to put up the manpower to actually administer that? Especially if over the next sort of 50 years, we're going to see a further breakdown of global trade, where nations put up more trade barriers and put more regulation on what capital is and isn't allowed to do.
Now, I think with North America by 2050, I mean, to be honest, I would be very surprised if Mexico is a functioning state in 2050, because the historic norm for Mexico is that it's wrought with internal divisions, whether it's, military coup d'etats with caudillos, or revolutions, or civil wars, or even foreign invasion. The most serious being in 1862 with the French invasion and the imposition of Maximilian. I think Mexico, there might be a country called Mexico in the sense that there's a country called Somalia, but I think that's just going to be a name on a map. And the United States by 2050, I think, will be converging on, and this is something Keith Preston has been saying for a while, and I think he's probably right, Latin American norms, where you'll have this wealthy elite that lives in cities and is very, globalist and urbanized, but then there's going to be this broader chaos radiating out from the hinterland and some of the urban areas that don't get the money transfer as well, looking more like Brazil than, say, Canada or Great Britain.
Well, at the same time, though, I think that very much depends on what politics does at home in the UK and the US and nations like this. So if you're looking with nations that have significant left behind areas like the UK and the US, at the same time, I think that we have seen political trends that have tried to communicate to those areas. And it really does depend on if that continues or not. I mean, if you think, I don't really see Biden as being massively different to Trump in much of his rhetoric. And, this ties into the broader trend of populism.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you can always look at the left behind areas. And I get it. There's always going to be unproductive sections of society. But the question is, can the political class sufficiently do anything about that over the next 50 years? I think there's signs that the will is there, but whether that's anything more than just gesture politics, I don't know yet.
Right. And so now we'll just end with the 100-year mark. Now, of course, both Friedman's predictions and any predictions I offer, we won't live to see. But I think, broadly speaking, what I would expect to see in Eurasia by 2100 is a world that looks a lot more like 1500 than anything else we've seen in the predictions. And this is the main reason why. The reason why Europe and by extension North America were fundamentally able to tilt the whole world towards them in this very unbalanced way was the result of the financial revolution in the 15th and 16th century, which allowed for rapid capitalization, which fueled the exploration of the high seas and the control of global resources through colonization. And as the other nations around the world catch up, as the dissemination of this technology continues, I don't necessarily see them supplanting the West, but rather resorting to the traditional trends and norms that had existed prior to what modern day sociologists and historians call the Great Divergence, which happens around 1500. And so what I see is the end of the Great Divergence, where things begun to look a lot more like they used to before that happened. So I'm not predicting that China takes over the world. I'm not predicting that, you know, some Eurasian alliance takes over the world. It's more like that as they approach us and we fall down, it's going to be a more traditional orientation of Eurasian norms. Now in North America and South America, the indigenous populations mostly died off due to diseases, and they won't look anything like 1500 because it's going to be a totally different setup. But what I would say is I see that the principles of fission and separation are going to be stronger than the forces of fusion and, you know, cohesion, putting them together. So they might still exist as names on a map. They might not. Places like US, Canada, Mexico are going to be more fragmented and divided. So I guess in that sense, like the Native American tribes of 1500, there's going to be these competing identities that are less rooted in, say, the idea of being a Mexican or to being American or Canadian, but more local rooted identities that are exerting power from the bottom up. Now, whether that means that leads to the complete collapse of those countries or just a weakened perspective, that's sort of what I would foresee by 2100.
Well, again, I mean, I think that if you just have to look at what the trends that are taking place are over the last sort of decade, and I do think we're at an inflection point. I mean, we've had sort of basically 70 years being generous of globalization. It's clear that we're seeing, you know, a deglobalization wave. And I think to some extent that's been driven by technology as an underlying factor. Because, I mean, the only reason that globalization used to be necessary is because you couldn't physically pick up the phone to a producer in China and say, print me this. Well, you know, you can now. And really, I think that globalism force is basically a construct of the 1950s, that technology is actively supplanting as an overlying trend. And as well as that, I mean, I think you have to look at basically one of the main reasons we had globalism in the first place was because of the wave of inflation that was hitting the US and the UK at the time. You know, it was actively believed that if we crushed the unions and outsourced all their production to China and these other nations, that we would get rid of inflation. And, you know, that might have worked, but I think that with inflation being back anyway, that's kind of lost its potency as an argument. So,
nearing the end of the hour, what would you like to leave the audience with as a sort of a capstone to all of this broader discussion we've been having?
I mean, with people like Friedman and Zeihan, I don't think anyone has a full picture of anything yet. I mean, what I don't like about Zeihan is that he does seem to buy into this belief of money printing. And I think that if you look at it, that's not true. And, you know, I know it's a typical libertarian meme and it goes around the internet and that's where people pick it up from. So I think that you can't really sort of become a fan of any one particular analysis, and you do have to go around and actively steal the best ideas and throw the rest under the bus.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I just want to say thanks for coming on, Dean. I'm really glad Keith introduced us. Where can people go to find some of the work you do?
Well, I mean, I do blog at rogueeconomics.net. I'm on Facebook if anyone wants to add me up. And that's it, basically.
All right. So before we wrap up, I got one super chat. I need to read that. Ori Samsonov, a longtime supporter, says, here's 100 shekels to help you influence what happens in the next 100 years. Thanks, Ori. Much appreciated. And thank you, Dean. This was a very pleasurable discussion.
Thanks for having me on.
This is Todd Lewis of the President Folly Podcast, signing off.